Hi, Ami.
Hi, Anand.
Hey, Avik.
Catalyst 2030 started life as a WhatsApp group among social entrepreneurs, connecting to envision real transformational change. Launched at the World Economic Forum in January 2020, it's grown into a global movement accelerating change to ensure the SDGs are reached by 2030. Fueled by passion, our 550 members working in 175 countries have collectively put in an amazing 50,000 volunteer hours, touching the lives of 2 billion people. And we're driven by values, to which we hold ourselves accountable. 2020 was a busy year, co-creating 3 reports with partners and producing one of our own. Inviting high-level guests to participate in the Catalyzing Change campaign, hosting fireside chats and expert hours, which will be continuing in 2021. To celebrate our achievements, together we placed our supporters in the limelight with the first Catalyst 2030 Awards for Systemic Change. With the blessing of the Dalai Lama, we celebrated finalists and winners in the following categories: special recognition for our early supporters, individual philanthropists, donor organizations, philanthropic intermediaries, corporate organizations, bi- and multilateral organizations, and 4 regional winners in the category of national governments. And now on to Catalyzing Change Week 2021. During this social entrepreneur-led event, we bring together diverse stakeholders in over 100 sessions to showcase their systems change efforts and the best practices that can accelerate our work in pursuit of the SDGs.
Thank you, Martina. Good morning, good evening, everyone. I'm Anand, and I'm with Socion. And today we're going to be talking about this idea called creating a nutrient-rich ecosystem for social entrepreneurs and for impact. So before I get started, I'd like to, let me actually share my presentation here so that we can, just give me a second. So this is the topic of our discussion today. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce my co-panelists. And Mala and Sanjay, if you can briefly introduce yourself, and then I'll introduce myself if we can get started. So over to you, Mala, first.
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Mala Subramaniam, CEO of Argyam. We're an India-based foundation looking at participatory methods in water management, whether it's groundwater or springs, and been working with NGOs on the ground over the last 15 years. And at this point in time, looking at how can participatory methods scale with the involvement of both the state, the government, as well as civil society, using amplifying tools like digital and process re-engineering that can help the ecosystem do much more with less, because that's the need of the hour. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mala. Sanjay?
Yeah, hello, everyone. I'm Sanjay Joshie. I'm the Executive Director for the Foundation for Ecological Security. Foundation for Ecological Security, popularly known as FES, works in the area of conservation of natural resources of land and water, which broadly classified as commons. And presently we are engaged in working on a wicked problem facing the planet and the people. So as Mala said, we are also on a journey to bring in a large system change involving different actors to solve the issues in and around commons. Thank you. Over to Anand.
Yeah, thank you, Sanjay. And I'm Anand. I'm with Socion. Socion was born out of an idea that we need to work together and to collectively amplify impact. Some of the problems that we face continue to outpace our ability to solve these problems. while there is some amazing amount of work and high quality work that happens at the community level, the unit of change is still not big enough for us to be able to reach and have an impact in all the communities that need the help or where change is absolutely necessary at this time. So what we do is essentially partner with organizations like FES and Argyam and others to come up with strategies to amplify the impact of the work that they do, and then in the process reorient both their efforts as well as the energies of the ecosystem towards thinking about how do we collectively work together to solve these problems at scale. So that's our background. First of all, before we get started, it would be amiss if I didn't acknowledge the fact that we're all living in a sort of a surreal world and a very unfortunate set of incidents that are happening in the background while we have the luxury of sitting here and having this discussion. First of all, I want to thank you all for making time in these trying circumstances for being here. And this is part of the challenge that we all face, you know, while we all recognize, acknowledge, and are dealing with. Some of you are dealing with some significant challenges in the backdrop. The fact that we still show up and have faith in the fact that we have to do some of these things in order to ensure that we try and at least make a dent so we don't see similar situations in the future. Here we are. So with that, I just want to call out and say that, you know, we wish everybody well and hope that whatever's happening, I think, doesn't continue like this for too long. That said, I want to welcome everyone again. It's really nice to see everybody. If it is an option, I would really appreciate if you can switch on your cameras. It's always nice to see people and also recognize if there are any questions, if somebody has any opinions, we'd like to make the opportunity to draw those opinions from you. With that, we'll get started. I want to say at the outset that the intent is here to present an idea that we certainly have been working thanks to the efforts of Argyam and FES and other organizations who have taken this up, particularly in the area of commons and water security. And we work together, actually. We've been doing this for the last year and a half. So what we want to do is use this opportunity to actually seek your input. And we want to present this idea to you and present our hypotheses, share with you some of the progress that we made. But more importantly, we want your feedback. We want you to react to what we're saying. We want you to tell us whether you see something like this could be a possibility for us to do at scale globally. With that, here we go. So the first thing I'd like to do is acknowledge, you know, some of the work that's been happening. I know personally from interactions with Argyam, FES, and many other organizations and state actors that we have dealt with, that there is a challenge. You know, we know that there are over 2 million NGOs in India, over 5 million NGOs and nonprofits working towards societal development globally. But, and as a recent effort within the Catalyst 2030 ecosystem also sort of acknowledged, we need to create a world where social change innovators can achieve SDGs faster, hopefully by 2030, through some sort of, it will require some sort of unprecedented mobilization of social entrepreneurs and all the scarce resources that we have or don't have in some instances. So we have to create that environment. And I think today it is, I suspect people will relate to this, that there is still a sense that we work in silos. I think there's no shortage of intent, but the ability to work together is something that we need to improve. And this is really what, this is yet another acknowledgement of the challenge that we all face, where there are so many organizations, so many social entrepreneurs trying to come together to solve problems, but the enabling environment for that might be lacking. So with that in the backdrop, we've been working with multiple organizations to try and understand what happens when we try and solve some of these problems at scale. What are the typical challenges we face? Now, in the earlier days of this thought process, we were sort of drawn to the differences between the different sectors. So people would talk about how the healthcare sector is different, and what is different in water security, or how do you deal with issues of commons or violence against women or sanitation and so on and so forth. While there is definitely merit to the idea that there are some significant differences or nuances that differentiate the way we pursue societal problems across sectors, we also found that there is a lot of commonality across these sectors. One of the commonality, or we found three specific commonalities. These are issues, or rather what we call problems worth solving, that seem to crop up irrespective of which sector we're operating in, provided we are thinking about solving these problems at scale. One of them is this whole challenge of building participatory capacity. So whenever we meet social entrepreneurs, large government-led programs, government agencies, state actors, philanthropists, and talk about the implementation challenges, while the intent is there to scale what we're doing, when you try and do this across thousands of villages, or where we have to reach millions of people in a hurry, the challenge of building frontline capacity comes to the fore. The second one is, how do we work together? While we see many organizations working towards a vision of a water secure India, or ending violence against women and so on and so forth, there is little evidence that there is no coordination between these agencies, or there's no what we call situational awareness. It's very hard to figure out which other organizations are operating in our space, what they're doing, and so on. And then finally, we find that there is a huge need for changing policy, funding models, and operating models. That said, these models tend to rely on trusted or verifiable data. In the absence of that, it is very hard to make policy, and as well as the fact that we need data at saturation. So we find these problems cropping up irrespective of which problem or space that we're going in. So we'd like to spend a little time and tap into your experiences and seek your inputs on this. And maybe I'll call on Mala to go first and maybe share your experience on some of these areas, Mala.
Yeah, sure. So I think from our sort of 15 years of work, and the first, we started looking at this in terms of how do we scale participatory about 3 years ago. And then sort of when we looked at what had happened till then, we felt like there was a lot of work that NGOs on the ground had done. I mean, tremendous progress had been made in terms of understanding the science of groundwater, which for India is a big thing, because invisible groundwater is what actually causes a lot of the issues with over abstraction. And also, how do you bring people together? What happens when you make this science, demystify this science, and does it bring people together? Do they actually rally around and look at the water supply situation and then sort of make their plans on the demand side? And we found that across the country, in different hydrogeology typologies, socio-economic typologies, we found that there was a certain approach that was certainly making sense for how participatory water management can be better. Many installations at the GP level, or the unit of the village, we did see, GP meaning the Gram Panchayat level, or village or habitation level, we saw a lot of success, and there was a lot of reduction in terms of dependence on tankers for water, and so which means that they were storing their groundwater much better, they were using their rain much better. But when we looked at what it would take to scale this, we felt that every next effort almost behaved as if nothing had happened before, right? So it was almost like there was a collective societal memory loss. Every time they'd said, what do we do? Where is the expert? How do we engage with them? Who are the people we need to train? What is the content? Where is the content? So we felt a lot of the implementation effort was, to use a very sort of macro word, was fairly inefficient, right? I mean, and it was, we felt that possibly there is something that we could do to therefore look at how do we reduce time effort in just getting programs off the ground, because a 4-year program would take 1.5 years just to identify all these pieces. And we felt that that's something we should possibly try and address. Why should it take so long? What if we create a memory for the ecosystem? So that's one example on the implementation side. On the waste side, we also felt that almost everyone working in that geography were pretty much doing similar things, but not really aware of each other. And I think we heard this many times from state governments, from others telling us, can you not get together and sort of figure out how you can be much more effective and not repeat the things that others are doing? And can you use what has already been done? So this whole idea of leveraging what has already been done, how do we convert expenditure to assets? So a lot of us as funders, as practitioners, were spending a lot of money, but it was in the realm of expenditure. So how do you make that and convert that to assets? And as we do that, the whole idea of using digital and looking at how we could actually amplify all of these capabilities and leave behind trusted data, trusted artifacts for the community is another idea that came up in the last 2 years as we're looking at what therefore can we do in the form of systems change. And this is across our programs, whether it's groundwater or springs or water quality. This was repeated again and again, and we really felt this was worth solving for. Anand?
Yeah. Thank you, Mala. Sanjay, I'd like to call on you. Maybe you can expand a little more on the wicked problem. It's just to give people the context of the scale of the problem that you're trying to solve, and maybe highlight some of the experiences you've had in these areas.
Yeah, thank you, Anand. Would like to dwell a bit more on you can say the audacity of the problem that we are, as a country, we are facing in terms of when we look at India, we have more than 200 million acres of land, which is classified as commons, and which includes community forests, pastures, and water bodies. But when we look at the Indian population and their dependence on these commons to meet their basic needs of food, fodder, and fuel wood, it is immense. Yet, when we look at these lands, it is under severe degradation, which is also impacting the livelihoods of the rural community. So it's about the wicked problem we are saying. It's a complex problem. It's not that there is one solution to it, and it has to be approached from different directions, as well as the impact of the whole problem which is facing the commons. It is also on diverse kind of fields, in terms of livelihoods, in terms of water, in terms of overall environment, ecology of that region. So that's the whole ambit under which we are operating. So some of the pertinent questions that we need to address are, firstly, how can a country like India, with about 1.3 billion people and about a third of them living in poverty, afford to neglect a quarter of its land mass? So if you look at the extent of commons in India, it's nearly a quarter of the land mass. And how can India govern this land better? So that is one pressing question that we are grappling with. Secondly, how can an organization like us, like FES, join the dots between various actors and initiatives? As Mala was referring to, how can we collaborate basically to move the system to a new equilibrium, where the voice, agency, power, and control strongly rests with the local community, especially when we talk about dependence on these commons, it is women. So how we can ensure that the women have their rights, their say in the decision-making and governance of these commons. Thirdly, we also are grappling with the point that how to enhance these capacity that exist at community level, at the NGO level, at the government level, and improving better planning and implementation on ground using data, information, tools, and technology. And lastly, and importantly, how can we unlock the true potential of the ecosystem to increase the economic opportunities of local communities who are, while also delivering the global benefits in terms of improved ecology of that region. Therefore, when we look at this problem, we also have experience in the past that working on issues like tenure, working on issues of collective governance, working on issues of restoration activities do result into gains in terms of better economic growth as well as better ecological outcomes. Therefore, what we have done is we have set a target of 38 to reach out to 38 million people to have secure rights to access, use, and manage over 30 million acres of commons, which we are 100% sure that we can't do on our own. That is, FES can't deliver that to that scale. So what we need to collaborate with a large sector of coalition of actors. So for that, we have a theory of change where we follow two strategic pathways of expanding action on ground and strengthening the enabling environment, that is the policy environment at state and the national level. And for all these things, we need to expand the coalition of actors pressing for change in the whole system. When we try to unfold this whole ask, it is quite a challenging thing that we have set ourselves to achieve in the next 5 years. For that, what we are aiming is to partner with 13 state governments, basically to embed the commons in the state agenda at policy and programmatic level. We are destined to collaborate with 250 plus organizations, NGOs, to take up the issues of commons along with us, build capacities of over 1 million people for improving the larger capacities at the community level, at the NGO level, at the government level, for improved planning and implementation. There is a strong need to work with 25 state government and government programs to take up action on commons. We have to work on building more champions across this board. We have to partner with research bodies to build evidences for effectiveness of the model, improve the quality of data, and develop learning curve to improve the action on ground. But what we have learned over the past year and a half, where because of the COVID-induced lockdown, we had to get into the virtual world, and with the work with Socion and Argyam, we are already on the path of creating digital footprints of capacities, plans, training modules, lesson, data, and information, which would be available to the largest set of people, actors like government, like NGOs, even the community, to use it at scale. So the aim is to enhance the capacities at the larger scale level without on a common platform, so that people can use the data, use the resources that has been created for the larger common good. So that is the whole intent in this process. Thank you, Anand.
Thank you. So, and some of you, or many of you, are actually familiar with the reality on the ground. So I just want to share some of the experiences that we had as we got into these large-scale initiatives. And when we say what is scale, and I think scale itself has to be defined, but we could talk about hundreds of villages, thousands of villages over 5 years. Most large national programs tend to look at scale as you could see anywhere between 400 villages over 5 years to maybe a few thousand villages over 5-year journey. The need of the hour is very different. If you look at the urgency of the problem, one of the states that we will refer to later in this discussion is the state of Meghalaya, which is one of the smallest states in India, but heavily dependent on natural resources. The sense of urgency for them is they need to reach and enable new initiatives across 6,500 villages every year. And in order to do that, just for one specific area, we're talking about natural resource management. In their current initiatives, they have to train over 18,000 people to make that happen. And you're talking about training 18,000 people in all the topics that both Sanjay and Mala referred to. How do you identify problems? How do you identify springs? How do you identify water bodies? How do you identify possible interventions? How do you measure demand? How do you map that demand? How do you come up with solutions and design solutions that will help them address the demand for water locally? How do you achieve water security? How do you sustain that? I mean, there's tremendous amount of, and then how do you work with local communities? How do you mobilize them? There are skills that have to be developed, which require tremendous amount of training, nurturing of skills, and enabling them and essentially strengthening their efficacy so that they can apply those skills on the ground. So we're talking about a fairly complex mobilization process. And as you can imagine, unlike the larger view where we can talk about the numbers and drop, thousands of people in millions of acres, when you get down on the ground, these capacity building efforts today are marred by delays. Delays in utilization of funds. There are funds available, but the utilization is very low. We're talking about anywhere between 3% to 10% to 20% of the money that is available is being utilized, because when you try and do things at scale, it doesn't work as you planned. There's a lot of attrition, there's a lot of turnover. There's very little ability to see who attended what training, who's been trained, who's not been trained, what they're doing after the training. There's many questions that start to pop up when you go from a few hundred people to tens of thousands of people that you need to mobilize at any given point in time. Similarly, we also believe that, as Mala said, the underlying challenge that, I don't know if many of you know, but in water, sanitation, and basic health, the government of India alone would probably be training a few million people this year. A few million people across government institutions, local community-led institutions, as well as frontline workers, few million people. Now, the question is, what happened to the previous millions of people that have been trained? I mean, water, health, and sanitation is not a new topic. So why do we keep doing this again? And what happened to the capacity? Are we just training, or are we actually building capacity? So a lot of questions that come up. And I think the point of this discussion is to first set the frame and say, what do we mean? We often kind of skim through the idea of scale. So what do we mean when we say scale? What does it look like? And I'll add one last thing, and then I would love to hear from some of you over the next 10 or 15 minutes, because it's very important to understand what you see from the challenges that you're trying to solve. The last one is around data. We hear a lot about, oh, there's lots of data, there's tons of data. In the last 2-3 years that we've been pursuing this actively, we actually realized that data is a very tricky business. If that data can be trusted within your organization, but if the data is not trusted when it leaves your organization, and then that data is not worth much, there's not a lot people are willing to do with it. Let me give you an example. If an employee of mine goes to a community and then comes back with a report that says there are 50 families, right, and 400 goats, and 10 water bodies, we will immediately take that information and actionize it, and we will come up with implementation plans, we'll come up with interventions, whatever it is that we have. Now imagine we leave that information in a database or a docket somewhere. And 6 months later, another organization comes and finds this piece of data about that village. What do you think they're willing to do with that data without validating it again or verifying it or going back to the community to check on it? What can you do with this data? Can you act on this data and automatically start planning interventions? What happens? So we started to ask these sort of very basic questions, saying, can you use this to pay people? Saying, oh, there was some other organization that had data, so we're just going to use that and pay communities for or disburse some of the funds that are available. Would we do that? Or would we go and verify them again? It turns out that the demand on data is quite high in terms of trust and verifiability. In the absence of that, there's very little we can do with it. So we started to run into these kind of issues. So collectively, we felt that irrespective of which sector we're operating in, if we can significantly improve the way that we build capacity, and more importantly, if we improve our ability to use the capacity that has already been built by others in adjacent areas or similar areas. Similarly, if we can build more situational awareness, if we can go into a territory, typically most NGOs operate through regional footprints. Can you go into your regional footprint and see who else is operating there, what their intent is, what they have already accomplished, and can you pick up the phone or write them an email and say, hey, I think we're better off partnering rather than trying to reinvent the wheel. How do we work together? How many times do these calls happen, and how is it based on actual fact? Most people shudder at this thought today. And what if that same information was available to funders? Right? What questions would they ask? Saying, why are you doing this again? I already see 3 organizations operating in this area. So things like this. So we're starting to think about this and saying, what do we need to solve these problems? So I'm going to stop here for a second. And I'd like to call on a few people. If you have any thoughts, comments, if you want me to bring up that slide again, happy to, but I'd rather look at you and hear you. Any comments, thoughts, or anybody who can share some examples that sort of either agree or disagree with the hypotheses around the common problems across sectors? And more importantly, do you think these problems are worth solving? And will that lead to sort of a much more enabling environment? Anybody? Ami?
I was just about trying to raise my hand.
Yeah.
But I think what you have addressed here, Anand, Mala, and Sanjay, is something that is very, very relevant, and it is the need of the hour to solve, because this working in silos and not being able to, I would say, work forward with each other is something that is a huge gap, and I think it's the need of the hour, and I think it is more needed now than ever. So I think we do need to look at it. And I think this whole the concept of digital nutrients that Anand, you touched upon with us earlier at industry, I think is something that really needs to build upon. And it's the sector is not, you can't say a farmer is not going to need something from off farm. So it's all there, and we need to just, I think, coincide and work together. So I think it's
right.
Definitely work, and the enabling environment is much needed. Because currently that is lacking, so we need to create that. Yeah,
it's a good point that you bring up, which is that we tend to, at least on paper, divide the world into farm and off farm and water sectors, but the reality is they're all connected at the problem level, right? That the people that are working on agricultural productivity are also dealing with water shortages or water management practices or things like that. And similarly, somebody working with a farmer will realize that you cannot just increase their income by just improving farm productivity, that any ideas that you can bring in to use byproducts from the farm to generate additional income is something that you have to work on. You can't just isolate problems. Problems are always connected, right? So when we talk about building capacity, they sometimes have to span these adjacent areas. So definitely a lot of value there. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, Anand just wanted to bring an example in front of everyone. It's the simple issue of the forest rights. And the Forest Right Act is there, and there's a legal provision under which people can claim rights over the forest land in India. But there are various aspects that are reflected over there. One is that the department that is entrusted with the responsibility of recognizing people's right is not the department which actually holds the land. So there is a conflict over there, and these two departments don't interact with each other. So they work in silos. They don't plan together. One department which holds the land doesn't want to leave the land. The other department has the responsibility of giving the land. To add, people are applying. People don't know the data is absent. So there's a lot of you can say lack of clarity when the claim will be recognized, when the claim will be rejected. If it is rejected, why it is rejected. So in the absence of the entire data that is available for the people who actually would like to apply and who are applying, as well as the facilitating agencies like the NGOs who work on the sector to facilitate the whole process, in the absence of the data, there was certainly a lull in terms of what to do, where to do, and how to do. So each and every organization are kind of grappling with the whole issue. Some are getting successful by chance that there's a good official over there, but without, you can say, in absence of a complete gap of data evidences on ground, there is an element of doubt that always exists in terms of how we are approaching and how a claim is getting approved or rejected. So that is
Absolutely.
just an example of the problems that people face on ground.
Thank you, Sanjay. Any other thoughts? I have one example, but I want to really hear from others. Is there anyone else that has any thoughts on this? So maybe, I mean, Mala, I'd like to call on you to, so one of the problems we saw, as you know, recently is that, there is an interest, particularly in the case of water, to fashion these large national level programs, right? But then when we have the discussion, and this was a discussion you were leading as well, it seems like the knowledge that exists in one state, because there was a certain NGO in that state that had a disproportionate amount of experience dealing with such community-led challenges or participatory challenges, that same knowledge was not visible in the approach that another state was taking, right? Although it is relevant. So could you speak about that challenge briefly?
Yeah. Like I said, I think the work that we did with NGOs across hydrogeologies in India, and largely the 5 to 6 typologies that we worked in, we saw that while there is a lot of context specific knowledge that was required, a lot of it was also not really, it was agnostic to the specific situation. So a lot of the approaches could actually be abstracted and be applicable across. But even so, when we started looking at how different geographies were looking at their programs, how they were implementing their programs, we felt that there was a lot of asymmetry between what is possible and what was actually happening because of lack of awareness, because of lack of ability to search and discover, and lack of just the confidence that it can happen in a certain way, because they did not have access to that particular framework or body of knowledge or experts. So we felt that just exposing that and making that more sort of available as an option, a lot of confidence got built that if it happened there, why don't we just pick it up and sort of just put it into our framework rather than rediscover and sort of relearn that. And if you do it in a sort of non-threatening way, if you will, I mean, if you bring it in as an example, as an option, as a choice, I feel like, and with trust and confidence, I feel like the adoption for that is very, very high. And we've seen that in many places. I think the problem is when they are not able to access, even if they know how, they're not able to access or search or discover with confidence. I think the friction there is just a lot of effort for them to reuse something. So if you remove that friction, reusability factor goes up very, very high, very high, and we've seen that happen. I think the fear that they will have to rework with something that's already there, the confidence, lack of confidence is what is preventing that, is what we think is a big problem worth solving.
Absolutely. And it almost feels like, we have inadvertently erected these walls and we cannot see through these walls. And even if you can get people together, they will quickly agree that there is need for more collaboration. It's almost instinctive, but then the follow through is weak, as in it seems like who is going to coordinate this? How will we do this? Who will facilitate this? Everybody believes they have the content and they have, yes, we can share, but then it's not available in a manner that it is easily shareable. So we've been part of these conversations where doesn't seem to be any lack of intent to share information or share data or share knowledge. In fact, there is a thrust to do that more and more, but I think it's leading to more frustration than it is leading to any sort of visible action. So this is the context. I don't want to belabor this if people would rather get to the, so how do we solve this problem? So we started, unless anybody had any thoughts, please stop me. I will just move to the, sorry, give me a second here. So these are the problems. These are some common problems, and these are, I think, very significant problems, meaning that if we're able to address these challenges, I think we could unlock tremendous amount of nonlinear potential in the ecosystem. The work that one organization can do, I think they can sort of double, triple the amount of impact that they can have. So we tried to approach this, and as you can imagine, there are a lot of when there's a sense of urgency and we want to solve these problems, we tend to look at it immediately and say we should use digital systems, we should automate this, we should use mechanisms by which people can share data. So we looked at more traditional approaches, but we quickly found that they are unlikely to work at scale, right? So bit of hindsight, but if you can think about it, we felt that the best way to try and solve some of these large, complex population scale challenges, it would be to turn to nature. So the analogy is, imagine how in nature we find soil playing a very significant role as a core infrastructure, right? And anything that is living sort of either generates nutrients and leaves behind something that is converted to nutrients, or becomes nutrients after it perishes. And those nutrients continue to persist in that soil. And then new life form picks up on those nutrients, and new life is generated from it, right? And it's something that the form of the organism or plant that essentially generated the nutrient and the form of the organism or plant that was generated from that nutrient are very different potentially. So we said, why is there a way to mimic this? Is there a way that we can create a nutrient-rich ecosystem where every social enterprise can, in the work that they do, generate some form of a nutrient, and how do we leave that behind and what impact can it have? So the first question, of course, was what sort of nutrients can we generate? What would be analogous to nutrients in nature? And what could be a nutrient that if organizations could generate and leave behind would be useful to somebody else? So we started looking at this, and we've looked at healthcare initiatives across India, Africa, US. We've looked across sectors. We've seen large programs, we've seen small programs, and there are a few common things that seem to appear as potential candidates for as nutrients. One is every program has a charter, and we tend to underestimate it. We tend to see it just as a proposal that can get funding, but the reality is that document also has intent. It says that, hey, we're here, we're working on this problem, and we're going to be working in these 300 villages or 400 villages or 20 villages, or whatever the case might be. And this is our theory of change. This is what we believe need to happen. So there's a lot of valuable information in this program charter. But for some reason, the only place it belongs is on a database somewhere, and it's exchanged between funder and fundee, but very little happens to it. That document never sees the light of day beyond that. Second, we found that most organizations either borrow, use, reuse, or create training content related to the program, training content related to the ecosystem, training content related to the subject matter, the technical aspects, and so on and so forth. Consequently, we end up training people, and there are trained practitioners. Think of these trained practitioners as useful nutrients for the rest of the ecosystem, right? It's like, if you can imagine the tech sector, developers are nutrients. In the absence, if you had to train all the developers that you have to use, we would not have the tech sector. Instead, somebody trained a developer there and somebody else here is using that developer, and so on. So this, sort of natural exchange of these capabilities or capacities is incredibly important. Trainers and experts. Sometimes we've seen programs getting stuck because they are trying to find somebody who can conduct training on a subject matter, or provide some guidance, or do some verification, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, the last thing is we found another nutrient that is common to most programs is we all generate some plans, artifacts, maps, reports, studies, right? Which relate to specific communities or the region that we're dealing with, or the matter, subject matter. It could be relating to a particular asset, a well, or it could be related to a community, a demographic report, a PRA or a participatory or rural appraisal report, or it could be a water security plan, it could be a resource map of that community, and so on and so forth. So we actually started to feel encouraged that, look, there are these things that every social enterprise can generate. So we'd like to do a quick poll, if you're okay with it. Is what we want to do is basically, I want to hear from all of you saying that which of these program charter document, training content, trained practitioners information, trainers or experts, reports, field studies, etc., do you employ in the process of the work that you do, or in the work that you've seen being done in the communities? So we will just do a poll. You can select one or more of these choices. And basically what we want from you is saying, if we were to look across this room, how many of you believe that these are relevant artifacts or documents that we can generate? Interesting. Yeah. And of course, if you feel there is something that we have not mentioned here, I'd appreciate it if you can sort of put it in chat saying, if we missed something, or if there are other information, data, or artifacts that we can. Oh, looks like, are we done with the poll? It's fascinating. So we have 95% of the people saying that training content is something that we all generate. I think the next one is trained practitioners. Obviously, we leave a trail of trained people and practitioners, and then reports, field studies. Excellent. Thank you. This is very useful. So as you can see, and I think if there are any other, can I stop sharing the results, Martina?
Yes, you can. I closed the poll anyway.
Okay, all right, great. So as you can see, we, in our work with different organizations, started to feel like this is something. If there are any other nutrients or what we call nutrients now, if you think that we can acknowledge and sort of take into account, that would be great. So I'm just going to now share this back to this presentation. Here we go. So what we did is we said, okay, and I'd love for Sanjay and Mala to pitch in. So we said, what if every social entrepreneur or social enterprise or program leaves behind information, data, and artifacts, byproducts that others can do. So I have a question before I move into the rest of the thing, and Mala and Sanjay can add as well. Early on, if you recall, when we started discussing, there was some skepticism about the willingness to do this. Could you address that, Mala?
Sorry, Anand, I didn't get the question. Could you repeat?
So if you recall, when we started sharing this hypothesis, saying, will people leave behind, be willing to share data, or will be willing to share these artifacts? Yes. There was a certain amount of healthy skepticism, if you will, about the willingness to be transparent, or, So I just would love to sort of draw on your experience in this journey.
Yeah, I think, any change requires, sort of consideration of what might happen when you do that. And I think even with content, the first thing we started off, Anand, if you remember, was really to say, can you put out your content? And the whole idea was, this is our sort of material. What happens if we put this out in the open? Do we really have, are we giving out something that then will come back to haunt us, kind of thinking? in the ecosystem. But I think what very quickly happened was that actually changed the way trainers looked at this whole idea of content plus delivery, and a lot of the push towards making digital content that's much more in the self-learning mode happened, and push to towards better content that actually trainees can use at their leisure and learn on their own. And the trainer time became much more about solving the problem now that you have content in your hands, and using applying that knowledge and discussing issues on the ground, so that even both the trainers and the trainees, I feel like there was a shift in the way they did things, and used this time much more productively, and therefore were able to amplify their efforts, because even the trainers were very happy to discuss different situations and use cases, rather than spend their time delivering the content as was the case earlier. And so on with data and artifacts. I think there's still some time to go. I mean, and we still have to see how it all pans out. But what we are seeing is that there's certainly good intent. They realize that there is a need for doing that. And just the fact that they are able to do that is giving them confidence and making them more ambitious about how they can do that. They're therefore changing processes that will allow for some of these things to be much more vetted, much more accurate, and therefore that is also increasing the quality of output, so to speak. Just the
Right.
fact that they've been now able to put out these contents, and they want to put out the contents because that's always been the intent, but they didn't know how to. So I think it's just the second order impact of driving up quality is really a very happy sort of outcome of this.
Yes, thank you. And I think so there is a journey to this, and I think it's while the intent has always been there, when it actually comes down to acting on it and saying, okay, so hang on, so are you saying that we're going to put all of this out in the open? People don't know how to react to that, so there's a little initial challenge, but then once they start to see that content out in the open, as you said, I think the whole the feedback mechanism starts to sort of kick in, and the content quality has improved, discussion around that topic has increased substantially, and so on. So I want to draw on Sanjay's experience. Sanjay, if you recall, when we were working together in some places, this also worked in the other way, which was, as this was the first time many practitioners actually had their profiles visible. Right. And this is the first time actually people felt that they were even seen, right? These frontline workers. Could you speak to that?
So I would share our experiences from the work that we did in Odisha. It's now nearly 1.5 years of work that has gone in. The task was to build capacities of the entire institutional structure that the Odisha Livelihood Mission has. It comprises of the grassroots workers in the name of Krishi Mitra, who are largely the village women who are being deployed as Krishi Mitra in these villages. And what we were interested to do is build their capacities to take forward improvement in agriculture. So the one way that when we started was a conventional method of looking at these as people who are accepted by the community to make a change. But we never knew what the capacities of these people were, whether they are trained on agriculture, they know agriculture, to what extent do they understand crop water budgeting kind of issues. So that was the journey where we started training them. But soon we realized that it is going to become a challenge as we increase our scale. So where we got help in terms of Socion coming in and looking at digitizing all the trainings and the participants, and looking at how we can monitor that a person is being trained on all the modules, which modules the person is missing, and completely creating a profile of of individual trainers who are being trained. It's not just the trainer who is getting trained, but the kind of training they are imparting further to the different people on ground, because the material is there, the kind of capacities that have been built over the time is also getting monitored. And this is something, when we look at the hindsight, it would have been very, very good for the organization if, when the Odisha Livelihood Mission had these kind of capacities already present in terms of as a data available to us to know which are the areas where the gap exists. We could only pitch in that, and for us, we would have got a platform which has already been built. So now, if this kind of data is available to different sector, the government or any other organization to come in, they can easily handpick few of these Krishi Mitra as their community level trainers or cadre to take the issue forward. Maybe a one simple training program can be given, and one can take forward with the people who have been delivering these results on ground, have a higher level of efficacy in terms of delivery. So these are some of the things that we now look in the hindsight and feel good about, that this is something which can be shared across the sector.
Right. And I think when we proposed the idea, and when we said, what if we were to publish, with consent, of course, publish the information of frontline workers, how would people react to it? Initial skepticism is around privacy, and so on. And those are all very valid concerns, saying, would it be okay to publish the names and the training background, or what they've been trained on, or their profile of frontline workers? We're talking about thousands of them in one state alone. But then what we did not really think about upfront was, how would it be perceived by the individuals? And when we approach the individuals, and again, this journey is not over yet, but what we found very interesting is that many of these individuals actually were very happy to see their profile out in the open. They said, I've been working in this area for the last 10 years, and there is no record of the work that I've done. There is no record of all the amazing trainings that I've already received. So when somebody approaches me in the future, I want them to approach me with a good understanding of what I have already done. So while we think about data, it conjures up these images of privacy and so on and so forth. We don't realize that data is actually of value to the individual whose data this is. So in this particular case, imagine having expertise and nobody knowing about it, right? So there was this other positive element to it as well, where while there is healthy skepticism about privacy, we also need to consider the fact that when data doesn't exist in a manner that it can be shared, it is also a problem for some people. The fact that people don't know I exist, the fact that people don't know that the work we did exists, is something that, is a bit of a challenge, not just systemically, but also at the individual level. So we said, what if we were to create this and leave behind all of these nutrients? Could we then create an open learning ecosystem where knowledge and expertise is open, where anybody else could come and grow roots into this shared digital infrastructure, if you will, and pick up whatever content they want, go and review any program, maybe contact programs and say, hey, we're trying to work in the same space. You've trained all these people. Can you help us tap into their expertise so that we can leverage them? Maybe they can make additional income. And consequently, we said, can this data be captured and left behind? Can we also have metadata, which is essentially a chain of custody, saying that this content was created on this day or uploaded by this organization in this program and used in training in this location? And the importance of that is that when you look at content, particularly in this case, it's actually helpful to know whether this was used by another government agency, whether this came from a trusted source, or what is the background for this information, right? Who is providing this information? Then my ability to use that information changes. So we said, how do we essentially leave this information behind in a manner that when people pick it up, that they can trust it, they can potentially digitally verify this data, digitally or otherwise verify this data, and use it to do a bunch of things, right? And the hypothesis is that if we were able to do this and increasingly sort of leave these nutrients behind, it could essentially act as an enabling environment where new NGOs can come in and, as Sanjay said, start by recognizing people who already exist in that area, who have related or similar skills, and start from there. You could shave off a year or two sometimes in large programs, which is often reserved for identifying people, what we call HR practices, right? And then recruiting them, training them, deploying them, and then tracking their participation efficacy, so on and so forth. We could literally remove that if you know of people who already exist, who know how to work in programs, who have similar skills, who have contacts and connects in that community, who know how to mobilize community. And if you were to just give them some sort of a top-up training related to your program, they could be off and running in days or weeks or months rather than years, right? So we said, so then the question is, okay, is this possible? And a year and a half ago, it was just an idea. But thanks to organizations that took the lead and sort of said that this is an inevitable, this is a problem, we have to tackle it whatever way. We've started doing this, and now we have hundreds of expert training content. And content, interestingly, this has been rolled out in pilots globally. So we have content around everything from how to package and store groundnuts. We have folks from Vritti here who are working in Pudukkottai in South India. We have proper ventilation during COVID, how to handle dead bodies in COVID, how to help people with HIV cope with COVID. Some amazing content that is being generated in far corners of the world, right? That is now available as open content that can be leveraged by anybody else. Child labor laws and guidelines, water and soil moisture management, and so on and so forth. These are just a few, probably a few hundred different such topics. Similarly, we have, thousands of trained practitioners listed, from Krishi Mitras in Orissa to artisans across Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, to thousands of landscape management practitioners, healthcare workers around the world, watermen or women, and so on and so forth. So as you can imagine, this is, and tens of programs, and now we're expecting also, this year alone, we're expecting somewhere in the region of tens of thousands of different artifacts to enter this nutrition-rich environment. So what we'd like to do is maybe share a quick demo of what this looks like. Anything to add here at this point, Mala?
No, Anand, not at this point.
So now, to be fair, what does it take to mobilize this? It's not, it hasn't been a very straightforward sort of, easy 1-2 step thing. We had to actually work with programs, and partly it was also our learning curve. But now I think we went through this idea of saying, what are those interactions that programs have, community appraisals, capacity building, interventions, design, planning activities. Yes, somebody had a point? No. Okay, so we went through this, and then we worked on building tools across the ecosystem. FES has built some tools, we built some tools, others are building tools, and I think this will continue to increase. And then we said, how do we design these tools so we can, generate trusted and verifiable data? How do we address interoperability of this information, data that comes out of this thing? How do these different pieces of information know whether they came from the same program or otherwise? And how do you convert them into digital nutrients and leave them behind? So there has been some work. I think what we are finding is, now that some of that work is done and people are able to visualize the outcomes, the amount of effort required to get there has substantially reduced and will continue to be an area of interest for us. But that said, I just wanted to kind of share with you an example. So here is, for example, I'm just gonna zoom out so we can see. This is one of the channels through which all of these digital nutrients are being released back into the ecosystem. So think of this as an open, container, digital container that can reside anywhere. And you can see that I have, access to 3 programs. But imagine there are actually about 20 odd programs. Not all of them have yet been able to use this tool and opt to share their data on this tool. But the first few programs we've approached have been very open and in fact interested in doing this because their own teams can also use this data. So for example, what this shows is it shows that this particular program has 1,987 people deployed. This has 1822. This has 2,502 people deployed in the ecosystem. You can actually see where they're deployed. So for example, if you go in to Meghalaya, one of the states that we're working with, which is, I would say, a pioneer in the way that they're approaching this problem, we're finding that this represents the footprint of these programs. So if I can say Meghalaya, or can I say NRM, I'll find, you will see that 2 programs stand out as natural resource management related programs. And of course, when I zoom out, I can see which programs are operating in the NRM space. Imagine you could do the same thing for education or sanitation or so on and so forth, where quickly you can say, okay, here are actually 2 programs that seem to have, something to do with this topic, and let me explore further. And then of course, if I'm from the community and let's say we're looking for a trainer, I could actually go in and click on one of these trainers. Now we have obfuscated some of the data here from a privacy, whatever perspective. So this is what is openly accessible. You can see that there is somebody in my vicinity who lives in this general area and has all of these trainings that they have already been part of. Now, by the way, this information is generated automatically as they participate in the training. This data gets generated and get tagged to their profile. So you can see that they have all of this expertise or they have been trained in these areas. And it's a good indicator. So I can actually go find different people, or I can find them by location, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is one part. So imagine tomorrow if a district head or another NGO enters this district and wants to understand, saying, what sort of capabilities exist on the ground and can we tap into that capability? So let's assume I'm saying, I know some names of districts. Just give me a second here. So I'm going to say, I want to go to Garo district, right? Boom, it tells me that, okay, there is 756 people that have been trained by this program, 741 people that have been trained by this program in this district, all right? So it's a way of essentially, democratizing this data so more people can use it. Second, when we look at content, I just want to remove this here. So when we look at content, this program has left behind 413 different pieces of content, 135. Now, let's say I want to look at something related to water, and I'm using short forms, but you can see that there are, so many content. So I could actually go in there and say, let me find, okay, here. Contour trenches, soil and water conservation. How do I build a contour trench? Okay, that's not. Okay, here you go. Consolidation through Spring Map manual, water budgeting. So this information, we have, as you can imagine with technology, we can protect the privacy of the people. We know there are lots of trainers that are available in these different locations. So we know that this program has trainer capacity, and if we can contact them, they should be able to allow us. In the future, we hope that these people will have an option to say, please publish my name. I want people to contact me directly, right? And of course, anybody can pull up this content and view it, learn from it. They could simply say, hey, this is clear enough, we'll go ahead and practice it. Or they could say, you know what, this requires a little more help. We want some clarification around these different concepts. Could we have a trainer? So we will contact a trainer and they could come in and help us. Now imagine all of this data is now publicly available, right? I'm going to show you one other thing here. This is the program version of it. We haven't completely made a completely open version. So because I'm logged in as a program administrator, I can actually see even artifacts coming in. So as people are generating plans and artifacts on the ground, we're able to see these artifacts. So potentially tomorrow, another program can come in and say, I'm working in this village right? And I want to look at this artifact, and I'm going to click on it and maybe download this artifact. What it does is it tells me the work that has already happened in that community, the data that has been collected in that community. As you can see, there's information that they have collected, made some notes, and so on and so forth. Plans have been made. So these are all available for future organizations or initiatives to come in and use. So this is an example of what we mean when we say creating a nutrient-rich environment for social enterprises and social entrepreneurs to work in. So I'm going to stop here for a second. Any questions? And then we'll maybe towards the end, we'll share how all of this is coming together in one particular state and how they're thinking about reimagining the way that they're going to work at the state level using such capabilities. I would really love to hear from you. And if there are any questions, if any of this was not clear, it'd be nice to get some thoughts. We do have a very quiet crowd this morning, or this evening, I would say, depending on where you are. Anybody care to share some thoughts? Prerak, John, Nicole. Does this make sense? Do you think this is too complicated, or do you believe that this is feasible in the kind of work that you're doing? How do we poke people? Is there a way to poke people? Yes, Avik. Avik?
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Okay. No, I think over the last few months that we have also been implementing this within our organization. I think we have seen a lot of value that the frontline as well as the beneficiaries have seen in terms of adopting an approach like this. So the whole fact that I think what we have heard from the ground is that now there is consistency in terms of how training gets delivered. People have access to material which is now, there is a certain standard to it. There is consistency in terms of training. The whole digital makes it much more easier for people across various locations to kind of understand best practices, what people in other districts are doing, which wasn't very easy. Like you said, experts who were earlier, who had to travel to other locations now are available at the click of a button. And then, it is not just experts in terms of experts who were formally designated, but it is also from within the community that people are emerging as experts who are sharing their knowledge with others. So there is significant merit in terms of how we see this happen. And like you have said earlier, that all of this, when it works at, when it moves at saturation, I think that's when we see a lot more benefits. So the goal is to try and see that how can we kind of extend this to as many beneficiaries that we can. And that's when we will get to the power of scale comes in.
Thank you. So Rupa, Haleen, any thoughts? Sorry to pick on you like that, but I'm trying to find ways to get some thoughts in before we get to the conclusion of this session. I guess not. Okay, I'll continue. And then I just wanted to share one example of how once we got from the conceptual phase to essentially demonstrating to people the ability to achieve something like this, what happened. And here is one such example. We were supposed to have a gentleman from the state of Meghalaya, but he was unfortunately unable to make it today. So I'm going to try and speak on his behalf, right? So what happened is today, fast forward a year and a half into this effort, the thanks to the work that has happened beyond this, this is just one part of it. The state is now instituting a statewide registry of NRM practitioners. So basically, in the past, what would happen is every program would come in, train a bunch of people, finish the job, and leave. And then the next program would come in, train a bunch of people, finish the job, and leave. And nobody could say whether you trained 1,000 people, we trained 1,000 people. Do we have 2,000 people trained, or did we use some of the same people? No idea. It was not part of the conversation. So now what the state leadership is saying is, look, as we start to develop a digital record of it and we put them back in a manner that others can see, we want the next set of programs and adjacent programs to start leveraging these practitioners, because they exist in these communities. They have experience and expertise in these areas. They have mobilized these communities before, and let's leverage them and the capacities that are already built. So that way, they also get more opportunities, maybe some additional income for the work that they're doing. And in the process, it becomes very productive because they will also commit to building that expertise, and they will start to see some potential for generating income for themselves and their own families by focusing on this area, and develop their identity around natural resource management. So in fact, the goal is here, I think they're going to be they're going to create a registry of roughly 15,000 plus people this year alone, and then expect that future programs, funded programs that come in similar or adjacent areas to leverage these people so that the expertise in the state goes up consistently and is not sort of a leaky bucket. Second is, they're encouraging new programs to leverage not just trained practitioners, but also the artifacts left behind by other programs. We've already seen this. We've already seen 3 different programs that started at different timeframes, now working together to say, let's ensure that we're not duplicating efforts, that if you've created a natural resource management plan for a community, the next program is not going and doing something similar there. Let's work off of that plan. And if necessary, validate that plan itself and then take it forward, or implement the recommendations made in that plan as opposed to creating a new plan. So we're already seeing the emphasis because the information is visible and it is there for people to verify, and there's no, how do you say, gap in understanding of what has already been accomplished. And then finally, how it is impacting policy, funding, and operating models. I mean, we've already seen that their ability to reach 6,500 villages in 1 year, I mean, it has substantially increased their confidence. And we keep saying, you know, as somebody put it, right, if you improve your ability to see, you can also improve your ability to solve. So the state has now taken on some massive challenges. And this year alone, while the last program was targeting 400 villages over 5 years, this year alone, they're now targeting 6,500 villages in 1 year. With the strength of this, you know, this capability. We're also seeing that earlier these cadres were not getting paid, or they were not being compensated proportionately to their skill set. Now they're putting in policies, the structures in place. Now that there is a verifiable record of the work that they have done, the trainings they've attended, and in the future artifacts that they've created, they will be able to create these different levels and pay them based on the experience or expertise that they have. So this is a huge thing. They're also improving, they're also working with the National Skill Development Council to create accreditation programs. So people who commit to building expertise and have a digitally verifiable record of that expertise can actually participate in evaluations and get accreditations, which then goes into, you know, the kind of opportunities and pathways that they will have. So collectively, what they're trying to do is essentially strengthen the institutional and institutionalize the capacity that is there across the state. So we're already seeing many of these things happening just in one state that we put. Yes, it's taken a fair amount of effort in the beginning, but I think now that we understand it, we hope that this can happen in many other places. I'll give you, we also know of multiple COVID capacity building initiatives done by academics, John Hopkins, and many other organizations, CDC and others, where similar thing has been used. So now there is a record of practitioners in different countries in Africa that have the capacity to deal with, different disease areas or, specific technical aspects of treatment or care. So this is not something that has to be limited to natural resource management of water, but can be expanded beyond that as well. So this is the call to action is, what we really want is more and more social entrepreneurs to come in and help us improve this and essentially commit to saying that whatever we generate, we will leave it behind for others to use. Second, we hope that funders will start, shifting their, or essentially take this into consideration and tell their portfolio organizations to start returning some of, or leaving behind some of these assets for others to use. And similarly, imagine if governments could do this and said that you're welcome, come and operate in our state and all the work you do, but please leave behind these assets. Imagine the amount of valuable data, information, reuse, and efficiency and effectiveness we can generate out of this if we do this for the next 3 to 5 years. With that, I'm going to stop and would like to invite any final comments or questions. We have another 10 minutes to go. And Sanjay, Mala, please feel free to add or leave a comment if you think I've missed anything.
Will do, Anand.
I have a question. And
yes, sir.
Yeah. While you were implementing this whole process and this whole step-by-step guided process, were there any operational obstacles? And I'm okay if you share something very high level as well that came along your way.
Yes, there were, because what we found, and correct me if I'm not answering your question directly. See, what happened is today we found that organizations that were used to doing things like training in person, if you dig deep and you ask them to follow a new kind of approach, you will start to realize that there are certain habits that have been formed. For example, people would show up without a lot of prior preparation for that session because they've done these in-person trainings a lot. And the way that you would conduct training when you are face-to-face with people is very different than the way you would think about the session if you have to meet people virtually. There's a lot more preparation. So we did find that initially people were struggling to make that shift, because the other big change that has happened, as Sanjay mentioned, in the last year and a half is not only did we generate this data and leave it behind, many of these capacity building sessions have moved online, right? Which is really not part of our plan, but I think it has become the norm. So there are certain things. Second is, we found that we have to involve participants. We realized that this data is not data that is entered by any individual, or we are not sitting on the other end and capturing this data. We had to train 16,000 people or 1,000 people or 400 people, or whatever the case might be. So there were questions around availability of phones, network, their ability to operate. So we ended up building systems that were easy to operate. And yes, initially, rolling that out, dealing with the objections, and all the skepticism that is out there. There's all healthy skepticism about network and availability of networks and so on. But so far, I don't think we've hit any significant snag that we couldn't overcome. But yes, I think when you take these new approaches to any program, there is a certain shift in mindset. There are conversations that need to happen. And often there are some skills, but we do believe that one of the things we have learned along with our partners is that we keep saying it's +1. We tried not to introduce too many changes. Some of the changes we introduced were actually so small that a lot of data gets generated, provided you can get people to do these two things. So we've been able to whittle it down to a handful of things that people have to actually do on the ground. And the consequence is tremendous amount of verifiable data gets generated, and which then And then once the data is generated, leaving behind, etc., is actually can be handled on a technology front, right? Individuals don't have to do that. Thank you.
Yeah,
Sure.
I think Anand, one of the things one would like to say, at least in a country like India, when we started, there was a lot of skepticism about technology, internet availability, smartphone availability, and all of that, right? And I think the first 6 months of the last year were really about dealing with those head on. And the things we realized was, while that probably remains a problem in terms of 100% inclusion. I mean, you probably say that 70-80% would be covered. While we initially thought maybe it would be 50 or 40, it is actually not that. I mean, there are ways in which people are coming around to solve the problem once they realize that there's value in this for them, right? So going back to the why of it, even as you start rolling out these processes step by step, as somebody talked about, I think just holding on to the why is very important, and constantly sort of going back to why are we doing this and how can we solve this. Sort of paved the way for a lot of those things to get resolved, even by the people that, themselves, right? They found ways in which they solved for it, right? And I think those are big learnings for us. So perhaps if the first one took a longer time for us to therefore understand all of these things and roll this out, the second and the third and the fourth, you're getting much better. And Anand, as we do that, we are unraveling newer things that we have to deal with, right? Now that there is all this data, what do we do with it? Seems to be the current thing, right? And at scale, how do we handle this enormous amount of knowledge and information that's coming, and making sense of it? So I think that will always be there. But I think some of these tools are giving us the ability to do much more than before. And maybe Anand, talking about the amplification numbers, could be useful, right?
It actually makes me uncomfortable to talk about the amplification numbers, because this quite unreal. To give you
I mean, it's just order of magnitude 50x, 60x, in terms of outputs, and about 10-20x drop in cost is what we are seeing now, which is quite, like Anand says, we still want to kind of validate that, so we don't want to put it out like in a fora like this, but it is generally moving in that direction. So if what took 5 years to do is possibly now get 10 times, 20 times that is getting done in a year. So just the order of magnitude is changing.
So, I mean, I'll give some anecdotal information. But for example, what happened is that the minute you could see exactly who is on the ground, what they have done, who has completed the foundational training, where artifacts are getting generated, that visibility took away a huge amount of effort from the program, right? So what we are seeing is two things, if any the data that we have so far is an indicator. One is, compared to 2 years ago, when you looked at the programs that were conceived in these spaces, and we looked at the total number of villages they were planning to reach, and we said, at this rate, how long will it take to reach all the villages in all of these states that these organizations are operating? And it was 142 years. Okay. And you will be surprised, go look at this. Sometimes it's 142 is actually quick, because the numbers are huge in India. We're talking about 600,000 villages. So if you say, oh, we're doing 1,000 villages, that sounds great, but that's 600 years to reach 600,000 villages, right? So 142 years was the number. This year, if you look at the same organizations and the proposals they have on how they can go and mobilize and reach villages and enable the same kind of outputs, it is 4 years. So the confidence to reach more villages on time, given that we now have this visibility and the ability to see, not just others can see what we did, but we can see what we're doing. That's the beauty of this, is that this is not just information for others. This is information for us, which consequently also others can see after the fact, right? Second is, we found that the unit cost, if you were to take the total program cost and divide it by the number of units, which is a village in this case, it was X. In the last 2 years, that unit cost, based on the proposals that these organizations have given, has dropped 6 times. right? In some cases, it has dropped more than 6 times. So we are very skeptical about it. We're like, okay, are we missing some line items here? Let's go back and look at it. And data is very difficult to figure out exactly, one program pays for it, this, other programs pays for something else. So we're doing some trying to get a handle on it. But early indicator is it has dropped significantly, that the unit cost has gone down, which is very healthy, right?
Yeah. Just to add a point over here is, yes, what Anand said in the initial years, there was a skepticism in terms of going digital. But since we had to solve the problem of going at scale and working at scale, we had to adopt this newer approach where the trainers were also very questioning the whole approach, that we don't have a physical contact with in terms of face-to-face interaction with the trainee. But overall, when we reflect back on the whole program, it has very positive insights also from especially the female trainees who are able to do it within their comfort of home, sitting in their home with their family, doing this training on a mobile, looking at everybody also understanding that she is part of a training and understanding that it's a capacity that is getting enhanced. She's not talking just out of like a hot air. It's solid training that she's receiving at her doorstep in terms of while she's cooking, she's also doing this training. So what one of the Krishi Mitra shared with us is that she's now getting an identity within their village ecosystem, that the people are recognizing her abilities. So there is a lot of social merit that is also generating out of the whole initiative, other than what Anand and Mala was explaining in terms of the reduction in cost and all these things. But we are not losing out on the part of the social importance that a person is a trainee or a community creator is garnering from the people merely by being able to attend these programs in front of the family, in front of the friends, in front of the village. So that is something I wanted to bring to light also.
Yeah. Well, with that, I think we're at the end of the session. We can take one more question if anybody has one. Any thoughts, Neha?
Yes, Anand, I would like to bring in a question out here.
Yes. Yes.
Being from I've come up from the education industries, and when we are looking at scale and the costing as such, when we go out and say that, okay, it costs $1 per child per month, okay, even that becomes difficult to sell, right? So in context of this, okay, if the app need to be scaled, what is that you're looking at to bring the cost down?
So we haven't done any benchmarking like that. It's not about the cost per participant. I think the cost we were referring to is, for example, in a large program, particularly in natural resource management, let's say they're going to cover 100 villages and it costs, 100,000 rupees, $100,000. That means you need, $1,000 per village. And what we have seen is that when there is actual credible, trusted, verifiable data that gets generated at the point that an interaction happens, and if the program staff is able to see that and participants are able to see what they've done, you reduce the amount of time and effort that goes into administrative overheads, reconciliation, back and forth. And we don't realize how huge that is. Right? And we found that when you eliminate that, the capacity of that limited group, like a state program unit, to take on more increases substantially. And the unit cost has dropped from what it was to 1/6. In one case, it is almost 1/20th. Right? And also we realized that if you can use the people that have already been trained by the previous program, imagine the amount of, let's say you're doing school leadership training, right? New NGO will come in and say, oh, we have to do this training. But 8 out of 10 things you're trying to train, imagine if they were already trained in that. Right? And you could recognize that because all the teachers had a record of all the trainings that they've done and all the work that they've done. And you can look at strengthening that capacity as opposed to rebuilding that capacity from scratch all over again. And we all seem to be doing it with good intent. but we don't realize that the overlap, right, is huge. And if we can eliminate those overlaps, there's significant amount of savings. So I think it's looking at it from a programmatic perspective at this time. I'm sure at some point we would love to work with somebody who is go down to that level and say, what is the unit cost at the beneficiary level as well.
Right. Thank you.
Okay. With that, I think we've run out of time, but thank you so much. Thanks a lot to Mala and Sanjay and many others. I noticed a lot of familiar faces in this thing, people who have actually contributed to making this happen. Subrat, Avik, and of course, many other folks. So thank you again, everyone, for being here. And I hope you have a wonderful day. And
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you.
Be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And wish you,
Thank you, everyone.
wish you all the very best. Yeah, thank you.